Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today it is bloody windy here where I am, so if there's a lot of background noise then yeah, I apologise for that, but unfortunately there isn't too much I can do about it. Ryzen processors just aren't quite powerful enough to control the weather. Yet. Anyway, today we're looking at how the new 3rd gen Ryzen processors work on a really affordable B350 motherboard, and the test subject for this experiment is the ASRock AB350M Pro 4. And you might be asking, why this particular ASRock Micro ATX motherboard? And the reason is quite simple. This was one of my top picks for the best ultra cheap B350 motherboard, and coming in at just $75, it was a steal back in 2017. It's also a great candidate for our 3rd gen Ryzen testing on a B350 board because it is extremely basic. It packs a 3-phase V-Core VRM using a 4-phase ISL 95712 controller, but we do get a doubling of components, so each phase features 2 high-side MOSFETs and 2 low-side MOSFETs. So in that sense, it's pretty decent for a sub $100 AM4 motherboard. Now, in this video, I want to investigate 2 main things. Can a budget B350 motherboard safely support the Ryzen 9 3900X? For example, how hot does the VRM get during a torture test? So we'll be strapping on a few K-type thermocouples to find out. Then, assuming we don't cook this poor little motherboard, we'll be looking at things like, well, are there any thermal issues, power limitations, or anything else that may be limiting performance of the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs? And obviously to do that, I will be testing the 3900X, 3700X, and then the vanilla 3600 that we just reviewed. And I'll be testing, all of those out on this ASRock board, and then comparing that to the data we've already gathered on the MSI X570 creation. Using BIOS version 5.90, the ASRock AB350M Pro 4 does support Zen 2 processors using the GISA version 1.0.0.1. Please note the MSI X570 creation was tested using the latest BIOS, which uses the GISA version 1.0.0.3, and this version was used for all previous testing and performs as expected. So let's jump straight into the results. And first up, we have VRM temperatures, and we'll look at what I would say is a worst case scenario first, at least until the Ryzen 9 3950X arrives. I don't expect many will be looking at pairing a 3900X with an entry-level B350 motherboard, but it is useful information for a few years down the track, at which point you'll likely be able to snag one of these 12-core parts for peanuts. Now, all this testing has been conducted on an open test bench with no additional cooling. However, it's not that unrealistic as I'm using the box cooler, which does direct airflow over the VRM heatsink, or at least one of them anyway. So this setup has the advantage of cool air circulation as it's not stuffed in a poorly ventilated case, but it has the disadvantage that there is no direct airflow from case fans. So stock, the Ryzen 9 3900X sucked down 145 watts, and this pushed VRM temps to peak at 65 degrees for the underside of the PCB, where most of the heat is dissipated, while the top side of the MOSFET driver peaked at just 51 degrees. Both are very safe operating temperatures for these components, and with 8 sensors I covered the board very well, so what you see here are the hot spots. Now, enabling PBO with the box cooler, it is rather pointless, as all it does is increase power consumption while resulting in really no extra performance. Still, it does stress the VRM more, so for this testing we are interested in doing exactly that. This increased the peak temperature on the underside of the PCB by 22%, and now we're seeing the board get up to around 80 degrees. Although these temperatures aren't dangerous, they are getting a bit too hot to sustain for long periods of time. The board is also right on the edge now, and with the PBO Plus Auto OC feature enabled in the Ryzen Master software, the ASRock AB350M Pro 4 did come unstuck. The board didn't suffer any major failure or crash, but the Blender 1 hour stress test did close down to the desktop after about 20 minutes, and this happened 3 times in a row, so I just took the hint and gave the little B350 board a rest. In short, it looks like the ASRock AB350M Pro 4 can comfortably deliver 150 watts, but once you start pushing over 180 watts, it just wants to pack it in. Moving over to the 65 watt TDP Ryzen 7 3700X, the B350 board didn't break a sweat. Sadly, I didn't measure the peak package power consumption when testing with the 3700X, I just didn't think of it at the time. I did test this processor first. and it only occurred to me that this would be an interesting thing to report when I was testing with the more power-hungry 3900X. Anyway, even with PBO plus Auto OC enabled, the 3700X ran flawlessly on the ASRock board, and VRM temps only peaked at 46 degrees, which is obviously very safe. That being the case, I didn't waste any time testing the Ryzen 5 3600. It's obviously not going to stress the VRM, so let's just move on. Actually, I did encounter one issue with the R5 3600. The memory support was a little bit flaky on this board, whereas the Ryzen 5 processor worked just fine with DDR4 3200 memory on the X570 board. It only worked up to DDR4 3000 on the ASRock B350 board, which is a bit interesting because the 3700X and 3900X worked just fine with DDR4 3200 memory on this exact board, though DDR4 3600 didn't work at all. And I should just clarify, by not work, it actually did post with DDR4 3200 memory. It loaded into Windows and it ran a lot of our benchmarks, but it blue screened every time we tried to run the Blender stress test. So it works to a degree, so maybe a future BIOS can iron out those stability issues. But for now, if you want it to be perfectly stable, DDR4 3000 is the limit. So memory support isn't nearly as good as the X570 motherboards, but that was almost certainly going to be the case, so no surprises there. It's possible that future BIOS revisions will enhance memory support, but it's just as likely that the signal quality on the B350 Pro 4 just isn't good enough to go beyond DDR4 3200. And then for the lower quality bin CPUs, such as the R5 3600, even 3200 is out of the question. This means for the benchmarks that you're about to see, the 3900X and 3700X were tested using DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, while the 3600 was testing using DDR4 3000 CL14 memory. Interestingly, despite the change in memory frequency, the R5 3600 actually sees the smallest performance discrepancy between the two boards tested. The X570 board was just under 1% faster, so chalk that up to margin of error. The 3700X, on the other hand, was 3% faster on the X570 board. Not a big margin by any means, but it was consistently 2 to 3% faster. Then we see the 3900X was 4% faster on the X570 board. Again, not a big margin, but there was clearly a small performance uplift when using the more modern board. But the board also costs around 7 times more, so I guess keep that in mind. When testing with Blender, I noticed the typical all-core clock frequency. It did jump around quite a bit, but after about half an hour, it settled into the clock speeds that you see reported here. Basically, the 3900X clocked 2.5% higher on the X570 board, the 3700X clocked 2.7% higher, and the R5 1600 clocked 0.1% higher. In short, performance was the same for the R5 3600. The 3700X took 2% longer to complete the test, and the 3900X took 4% longer, pretty much in line with the margins seen when testing with Cinebench. This time when testing with V-Ray, the 3900X was 5% faster on the X570 board, while the 3700X was just 3% faster, and we see the R5 3600 performing 1% better on the B350 board, so again within the margin of error. As for gaming performance, the R5 3600 was again able to deliver the same level of performance on both boards. The same was true for the 3700X, while the 3900X dropped a few frames. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a much more demanding game on the CPU, and here the 3900X and 3700X were 4% faster on the X570 board, while the 3600 saw a 1% FPS difference. Finishing up the benchmarks, we have total system power consumption while running the Blender test. The 3900X saw total system consumption drop by 10%, 16% for the 3700X, and 11% for the 3600. There are likely a few reasons for this. The high-end X570 motherboards might waste more power due to their extreme VRM implementations. We know the X570 chipset uses quite a bit more power as well, and those boards are generally littered with RGB LEDs, though the MSI creation is pretty good in that regard. Either way, it seems AMD Zen 2 CPUs are much more power efficient on 300 and 400 series boards. Okay, so the good news for those of you who own an entry-level AM4 motherboard is that they can easily handle the new Ryzen 5 3600, 3600X, and Ryzen 7 3700X. So no issues there, with perhaps the exception of questionable memory support, though that won't be anything new for anyone who's running a first or second gen Ryzen part on boards such as this. And really, even the Ryzen 9 3900X, that worked perfectly fine in its out-of-the-box configuration. Just don't expect that you'll be able to go overclocking the hell out of the 12-core CPU on this board. In fact, just don't go overclocking it at all. And again, memory support on this particular B350 motherboard was a little bit limited, DDR4 3200, but really that's all you need to get the maximum performance anyway from these Ryzen processors, assuming you're using low latency memory. And honestly, I don't believe Ryzen 9 3900X support is relevant right now. Still relevant, but right now not so much. In a few years' time, when you can get these CPUs secondhand for what I'm guessing will be around $100 to $200, then yeah, getting one and sticking it on a cheap B350 board such as this will be a really nice option. As for higher end B350 boards, yet to test any of those, but I'm just going to assume that those with beefier VRMs should be even better, assuming that the BIOS support is there. As for BIOS support, we are obviously in the really early days here, so the state of these older boards is likely to improve as the BIOSes get updated. I'm not sure whether they will update them any further. There's not a huge amount of incentive for board partners to do so. Obviously, they want to sell their newer boards, but they have rolled out updates, so yeah, maybe they will continue to work on those. We'll just have to see. There should be no real performance differences or improvements between the AGESA 1001 and 1003 versions. Things like memory compatibility, they could be improved along with stability in general, but I'm not expecting to see the BIOS revisions make any real difference to performance. I am aware of the challenges AMD and its board partners face with their backwards compatibility promise. For example, the storage capacity of the SPI Flash EEPROM chip that stores the motherboard UEFI firmware, it isn't really big enough to house the latest AGESA microcode, and that is a problem for a number of the entry-level and mid-range boards that only use a 16MB EEPROM. The X570 boards, they've been upgraded to a 32MB EEPROM, and that's no doubt to combat this compatibility issue moving forward, though they do drop support for first-gen parts anyway. To try and work around this issue, ASRock has made a light version of their BIOS that doesn't feature any colors and it has a very basic layout. But anyway, I'll be testing more B350 boards soon, as well as some of the cheaper X370 boards, and I'll be looking at other brands such as MSI, ASUS, and Gigabyte. On a final note that's pretty much unrelated to the testing in this video, but I just wanted to make mention of this issue here. It's an issue I was having with World War Z with the Ryzen processors. Performance was well down on where I was expecting it to be, a bit like what we see with Far Cry New Dawn, but there's no bug or issue there. So basically, yesterday I was testing the 3900X again just to make sure that all the numbers were where they should be, and I went to fire at World War Z, and there was an 8GB patch. So I downloaded the patch, installed it, didn't think too much of it, then reran the tests, and the performance was significantly better than what I'd reported in my reviews. So that was a bit of an issue. I went back, reconfirmed, the Ryzen performance is now very, very close to the 1900K. Now, this patch was apparently released early last week, so about the time that I started testing the Ryzen processors, but for whatever reason, the Epic Store only updated my copy on Monday. Now, at this point, I don't know if the patch addressed Ryzen performance. There's no mention of it in the notes that I've been able to find. So if it doesn't address performance with Ryzen, there was probably just something wrong with my copy, and the 8GB patch just fixed that. So I've reached out to AMD to try and help me on this one, see if they can find out what was going on. I have seen a few other reviewers that tested World War Z and did get better results than me, so it seems they probably tested with this updated patch if it did address performance, or yeah, perhaps there was just something wrong on my end. In either case, I will be updating my results next week. At the moment, I'm revalidating my 3rd gen Ryzen numbers. I'll also go back and just make sure 1st and 2nd gen parts haven't changed, and I'll do the same for the Intel CPUs. But I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm aware of this issue and I am working to resolve it. So yeah, sorry, but it'll be fixed next week, I promise. Anyway, I should wrap this video up so I can go back to doing that testing. If you like the video, please hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate all the time and effort we put in here at Hardware Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. You can gain access to our exclusive Discord chat, monthly live streams, all that good stuff. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you again next time.